Welcome to the Write Better Fiction podcast, the show that helps you, well, write better fiction. I'm Shane Miller, urban fantasy author, writing coach, and story geek, and each week I'll be talking to industry experts about the writing craft, publishing, and the business of being an author. Enjoy the show. Hello, Fictioneers, and welcome to episode 1 of the Write Better Fiction podcast. Today I'm chatting to Jeff Elkins all about how to write dialogue. You'll pick up a ton of actionable tips and tricks on how to create realistic character voices in this interview, so stay tuned for that. But first, let's talk about question of the week. Each week, I'm going to ask you a question about something related to being a writer, and I want you to come and get involved. I'll post the question of the week on Instagram and TikTok, and if you answer it, you might get a shout out from me on the show. I did put a call out on social media for the question for this episode, and that question was, why do you write? If you carry on listening for many, many weeks, you will see that this will be a recurring theme on this show. It's one of my favorite questions to ask people, so I ask all of my guests. And I wanted you to get in on the action too. On Instagram, HB Line, who is an upcoming guest on the show, said, you know why I write. I have to exercise the demons somehow. And I know Holly and I have similar thoughts on this. Judith Mortimer said, because the worlds in my head are much nicer than the real one. And Julia Scott Wrights, also an upcoming guest on the show, said, because it's better than doing drugs. Well, we can both agree on that, Julia. And then over on TikTok, Ian Benson said, because if I don't let the voices in my head destroy fictitious worlds, you lot are in trouble. Nice. JP Reinfleisch said, rebellion. I once made a list of all the things I didn't have time for. Then I read the list out loud. Most were, I don't want to clean, etc. But when I said I don't want to write or do art, I got angry and did something about it. Adam the Druid Poet said, expression, I have ideas that I need to get down on paper. And finally, Andrea said, I can't not write. I've got so many stories and scenarios in my head and I need to get them out of my brain. I definitely feel that last one. My question for you this week is, what's your favorite thing about writing characters? Leave me a comment on Instagram or TikTok and you could be in with a chance of getting a shout out on the show. In my first update from the writer's chair, I'm happy to announce that I'm almost finished with the dreaded rewrites on how to think like an author, or as I prefer to call it, the book that just won't die. And I'm hoping to publish that really soon. In terms of fiction, I'm working on the first urban fantasy book in a brand new series. And I won't lie, it has been quite tough to get back into fiction writing after so long. I mean, I haven't written fiction for months, and I'm aware that for some of you that's not very long, but for me that feels like a long time. And it's taken me a while to get back into it, but I've got to say, I am loving the book now. It's fun to just get to play with a new story, new ideas, new characters, and I'm trying to be very intentional for this one and really write it for the reader, so what an urban fantasy reader would expect. We'll see how that goes, but I'm having a lot of fun. And finally, April is going to be a busy month for me. I'm attending the 20 Books to 50K conference from the 13th to the 14th of April, and I'm in London on the week of the 17th for London Book Fair. So if anyone is going to either or both of those events, I really hope we get to meet in person. That would just be the coolest thing. If you want early access to episodes and exclusive access to the Fictioneer community on Discord, where you can participate in Question of the Week and weekly accountability and all sorts of other fun stuff, you can support the Write Better Fiction podcast on Patreon for $5 a month. Support the show at patreon.com/writebetterfiction. Oh, and when I reach 50 patrons, I'm going to start recording a Q&A session where I answer all of your burning writing, publishing, and author marketing questions. Okay, that's about it from me, so let's get into the interview with Jeff. Hello, and welcome to the Write Better Fiction podcast. Today, I'm joined by Jeff Elkins. Jeff is the author of 11 novels, a writing coach, a certified 3-story method editor, and the host of the Dialogue Doctor podcast, which I highly recommend. During the day, he leads the writing team for a training company that stimulates difficult conversation. He lives north of Baltimore, Maryland, with his wife of 25 years and his 5 kids. Hi, Jeff. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Shane. Thanks for having me on.
You're so welcome. I wonder if we can start by you telling us a bit about you and your writing journey.
Yeah, there's not a lot to tell. I started writing in like 2014, uh, and spent several years writing in complete isolation, making no friends in the author community, and that was drudgery and ill-advised. And so about 3 years ago, I turned that trajectory and started doing the Dialogue Doctor and connected with amazing authors like you, and life is happy now. So yeah, that's my writing journey. I just had a new book come out this year, came out March 18th. Nerds Season 1. So JP Reinflesh and I wrote a Vella on Amazon, which is their like serial fiction platform. So I wrote that for JP, and I wrote that for like a year and 3 or 4 months, and then we put it all together in a single volume and are publishing it, and we're writing season 2 right now. That's the most recent work that I'm doing. That's the like fiction I'm doing right now.
That's really cool. Really cool.
Yeah, it's fun.
Yeah, I bet. And I highly recommend the Dialogue Doctor community. You can go and find Jeff on Patreon. I'll put links in the show notes and all that good stuff. So
we have a good time.
Yeah, we do. We do. That's true.
It's fun.
Yeah. One of the concepts that you talk about a lot is monomouth. So I'm wondering if you could explain what that is and how writers can avoid it.
Yeah, so monomouth is when you read your manuscript or your series and you realize like, oh crap, all of my characters sound like me. Right? Like it's a really common problem. Like, oh, I have, and especially if you have like a personally like snarky voice, or like, if you have a personally distinctive voice, often all of your characters, all your protagonists across multiple books sound that way. All of your characters within a book sound that way. You might be able to pull off like one character that's a little bit different, but you know, everybody's kind of, I'll just lean on the snarky one. Everyone's kind of like snarky. Yeah, full of pop culture references, humor. And it's like, that's fine for one book, but it doesn't keep readers engaged long term. So what we have to do long term is start to differentiate those voices to give yourself a more like colorful palette to paint with. If you think of each voice as like a color that you get to paint with, a book that's entirely blue is great for one book, but then like book number 2 that's blue, you're like, okay, I get that this is going to be blue. The book number 3 that's like mild shades of blue, you're like, all right, we've done the blue, can we move on? So the key is to give you like this palette of colors to paint with by differentiating the voices in your work, and we do that by teaching people how to like not just write dialogue differently, like not just understand what dialogue writing is, but understand like on a core concept what a character voice is, how you maintain that across several works, and even down to like the nitty-gritty of like what different voices look like on the page. Like, so just getting, and you know, some authors just want the theory, like they want the like broad concept. They're like, I want the theory and then leave me alone with everything else. Some authors like just want the page. They're like, I don't want to talk about the theory, tell me where to put the comma. And like, that's, you know, so we try to do both so that you can get like over the Dialogue Doctor, so you can get all of it at once. But yeah, it's a frustrating problem, I think, monomouth is, because you don't necessarily discover it right away. Like it's one of those like you almost have to write for a bit before you take a step back and you're like, oh crap, like, you know. Yeah, because you have to when you first start writing, it's just about like, I just got to get these words out on the page, and then you're like, oh, my plot needs help. And then after you get your plot help, you look at it and you're like, there's still something broken. That's usually when you discover monomouth, is like there's still something broken. Then it's like, oh, I need to work on my character voices. Yeah.
Yeah, I laughed because you mentioned the snarky voice, and that is my I don't know whether you were picking on me, Jeff, or
I
whether it
wasn't.
was
I wasn't.
coincidence, but that is my kind of bog standard writing voice that I always rely on. So yeah, it's very interesting that you chose that example.
Yeah, I wasn't. It's actually like that's kind of, I think, since the Michael Anderle crew and like the Catherian Gambit kind of swept through science fiction, that's
Yeah.
been the kind of like go-to voice, is the like snarky, full of pop culture references
Mm-hmm.
voice. And I think a lot of us lean on it because readers like it. Like that's
Yeah.
the thing, is like readers like it. And it's in it, we find it in a lot of like kind of YA dramas
Mm-hmm.
on film and television and like streaming series. Like it's a popular voice, and it's a pretty, I think one of the reasons we all really like it is because it's very easy to be like, okay, I can make this character sound a certain way. They're always snarky, they're always a little biting, and they always have this like, pop culture edge to them. And it's, so I think we lean into that voice because it's easy to do, but there's 1,000 different colors you can paint with, right? Like you don't have to paint with that one. You can paint with so many different ones. And it's great if you've got that character in your cast because it is beloved, but that character works a lot better if all of the other characters around them feel very different. Like pairing that character with like a bubbly, naive, expressive character really matches well because they play off of each other in kind of like a, you know, bad buddy movie where like, kind of like frenemies type movie,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
they don't like each other, but they, have to work together. Like, so if we can like start pairing character voices like that, it allows our work to be way more dynamic and connect with readers on a deeper level. But no, I was not picking on you personally.
Okay. Sure. So apart from Monomouth, what? Yeah,
Sorry.
just to put this out there for listeners, Jeff's not being a dick. We actually know each other quite well, so I'm not just yeah.
Man, did Jeff read all of Shane's books before he came on the podcast and then just really mean about them? No, he's just mean about them all the time.
All the time, man.
Kidding. I love your
Sick of it.
books.
I'm sick of it. Okay, so apart from monomouth, what are the most common mistakes you see writers make when it comes to dialogue?
Yeah, so it's interesting in our community, they kind of come in waves. I don't know if that's because I can only think about one thing at a time or if that's because they're actually coming in waves. But I think part of it is because as the dialogue doctor community, we're all kind of learning together. So we kind of learn these things, and like, we worked on monomouth together for like 3 or 4 months. I feel like everything we talked about was like character description, like let's get character voices down. Another big one was like reflective, like understanding the difference between character interaction, which is dialogue, and reflective summaries, which is like narrator voice or first person POV, like thinking about things. Anytime you start getting like blocks or like world building, like anytime you start getting like blocks of paragraph on the page, another problem I think authors have is they don't understand those two tools. They don't understand what they do to a reader. Like they don't understand how they like change the reader experience. And so understanding that like, hey, your reflective summaries cause a reader to like back up and actually give the reader permission to skim. So you have to like use those strategically and sparingly and like not all at one time, and understanding the like interaction, how to like write dialogue on a page so that it's not constantly being interrupted by these pullbacks, reflective summaries. Like that's another big, especially if you're writing like historical fiction or you're writing fantasy. I find a lot of times we want to world build, so we're constantly pulling back from the dialogue to have these moments of reflection. So, and it's not necessarily always bad. It's about like understanding what these two tools do and how to use them to like create the user journey that you want to create, the reader journey you want to create. You can tell I work in tech because I use the word user all the time. The user journey,
user experience.
the user experience. So these are my nice tech words. Yeah, so that's a big one that I think people stumble with. The other one is that I think people they oscillate, like writers oscillate between not having an emotional experience for the reader, and then like they'll be like, oh crap, I need emotions here, and then it's like the emotional experience feels like a roller coaster that makes the reader sick, right? That's like, oh, I'm gonna puke. Like, so it's like, you know, they're happy, they're sad, they're happy, they're sad, they're happy, they're sad, and the reader's like, I can't take it anymore. It's like a
Yeah,
roller
yeah.
coaster that like nobody planned out. So it's that helping like writers understand, like, okay, this is like, you get your scene gets an emotional wave, and that wave like you want to be strategic about that pattern. You've got tools to create that emotion in the character voice, through the like utterances that the character's making. And you know, emotions will spike, but if they spike, they come down gently. More often than not, they kind of raise gently like a wave and then crash. And like, so understanding how emotions work, and then like understanding how to take the reader on that journey, that's another thing that I think writers struggle with a lot, because it's just one of those things that like good, like real, those of us that, there's a group of us that do that very naturally, and we make it look easy.
Mhm.
I'm saying we, I'm actually not one of those, but those a-holes make it look easy.
Yeah.
And so we don't talk about it a lot, because people who do it really well, and people who don't are like, I don't know, it's magic. But it's not magic. It's actually something that's like happening within the words on the page. And so,
Mhm.
you know, we can break it down, and we can learn how to craft an emotional journey for our reader from scene to scene to scene, to give an emotional texture to our story. I think that's probably the third biggest one I'm seeing right now. There's like character voice differentiation and like cast building. Then there's like using summaries versus staying in the moment. And then there's like understanding and crafting your emotional journey. Those are the three big ones.
Okay, cool. I'm going to ask you a question I didn't prepare you for based on your
I'm
answer there.
totally, I didn't read your questions anyway, so it doesn't matter.
Anyway, so you mentioned like reflective summary.
Yeah.
Is there ever a place for reflective summary? And if so, where would that place be?
Yeah, of course. So like, it's not about whether it's good or bad, it's, or like whether it's right or wrong. It's about like using it appropriately. So a reflective summary causes a reader to pause, and causes a reader to like take steps back from the moment and see the story as a whole. So in between segments, or like a segment is a topic change in conversation, or a like emotional shift, right? So it's super appropriate to have a reflective summary there, to have the reader with the character take a step back and be like, what just happened here, right? Like, totally appropriate. Or like to take a step back and be like, how do I feel about what's going on? Introducing new settings, introducing new characters, reflective summaries are super important, because we have to like set the stage of the reader's imagination so that they can like visualize the play that's going on, that you're trying to like help them visualize. So super important there. I even use them at big emotional turns, because something that you know, I talk about with writers a lot that I coach is like, hey, we've got this big emotional moment, right? Like, to get the reader to feel it, I know this is going to sound like that feels reductive, but it's not. To get the reader to feel it, you literally have to have more words on the page. More space on the page means the reader has to sit in that moment longer. So reflective summaries are great there, because like if you start like reflecting, like pulling back from the scene and making the reader sit in this emotion, they feel it more. So like, the more you, if you want to think about it like a movie, there are times where all action stops and the camera just pauses on somebody's face.
Mhm.
That is the impact of reflective summary on your novel, where like in a big powerful emotional moment, when you pull back and you just reflect on how the character's feeling at that moment and what that feeling is doing to them, it makes the reader sit in that feeling a lot longer, and like makes that emotional experience for the reader deeper. And I know it sounds reductive, like more words on page means reader stays longer. But it is really that simple. It's like, if you want a reader to like sit in an emotion, give them 3 paragraphs instead of 1, and now they have to sit there longer. There is a weird balance there, though. Like, I do tell author, it depends on genre, but on average, like, I try to tell authors like 3 to 5 paragraphs of reflective summary / world building. You know, you have it when it's like a paragraph and not the give and take of character interaction. So like 3 to 5 of those, and then modern readers start to skim. Now, like, if you're a historical fiction reader, you tend to give more because you like the, like, you know, the structure of the castle is really cool to you. Fantasy readers will give you a little bit more. Like, you can get 8 to 10 with fantasy and historical fiction, but even at that, like, they'll start, and you got to realize that like not all your readers reading that historical fiction are historical fiction readers, right? Like, some of them came to Outlander not because it takes place in ancient Scotland, but because they really like hot Scottish dudes. So those guys, like those readers, you want to like get the romance side, which is like romance, you get like 3, and then because they're all in for the emotion, right? Like, the romance reader is there for the character interaction. So if you give them more than 3 to 5 reflective summaries, they're like, skim, 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 where's the hot guy? There he is. And like, they're back into the moment. So yeah, so part of it is like knowing your genre, knowing your reader, how much reflective summary you can get away with in a row. So there is a balance, right? Like, they're a great tool, but you got to understand that tool, what that tool's doing to your reader, and then not hit them with that hammer for so long that they start to get frustrated with it.
Yeah, and you make a good point there about thinking of it like a movie, because we've all seen those movies where somebody dies and the music stops and they pan in on a particular object or a particular person or the other cast's reactions to that, and it's a slow pan. And they stay with it. So that kind of makes sense.
The classic example that I feel like a lot of people have seen is Marvel Endgame. I'm sorry, I'm gonna ruin this movie from 2017, from 6 years ago, 3 years ago, I don't know. But Iron Man dies. There you go. I ruined the movie. And they have this giant battle scene where you're getting like all of these scenes super fast. You're getting like, you know, Captain America fighting Thanos, and then Thor fights Thanos, and then you've got like the March of the Women, which is a weird thing that they bring out all the female characters and like march them through the battle, which is strange. I'm like, y'all couldn't have done that better. So, like, I'm all for it. I'm like, yes, bring out the female heroes, let's do that. But this is a weird way to do it.
Yes.
And then they have the, like, you know, Spider-Man like run through the thing, and so you have all of these things happening really fast, and all of these moments get like 3 seconds on camera, and then Iron Man dies, and we sit there for like a minute and a half. And we don't just sit there for a minute and a half. Like, we watch Spider-Man cry for a good minute. And it's crippling because he's the, like, again, so it's crippling, but let's be specific about why it's crippling, because that's the character voice of innocence in all of this. Right? That's the character voice of childlike innocence. So you kill that mentor to that voice, and then you have to watch that voice modulate and suffer, and you feel it. Like, the Thor characters is the character voice that is the like overconfident strength. We will not care as much watching him suffer, right? The you know, Captain Marvel voice is the voice of, like, I would say, self-conscious power, where she's very locked down emotionally, but is this massive, powerful character. You put that character voice watching somebody die, and she's going to stand stoically. Right. Like, so they found the perfect voice to modulate in that moment. And then they made you sit there for like a minute while you watched this voice of, you know, naive youth get his world destroyed. And like, but it literally was just time on the page. Like, if you think about it, if you think about your novel as a screenplay, every page of a screenplay is X amount of minutes, you're literally just taking up time in the reader's brain. And that's and then, you know, the question is like, you can do that every chapter.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a good reader experience? I don't know. I might get to chapter 3 and be like, whoo, this book's got a lot of feelings, right?
Yeah.
Like, so you got to kind of decide like when you're going to spin that token, right? Like, and I'll say, like, you know, the Marvel movies, they held that token for a long time. We
Yeah.
didn't see that kid feel that thing for like 5 movies, and then they spent all of that at once, and it, you know, paid off. So like, as a writer, understanding that you are in the same way crafting this emotional journey for your reader, you've got some tokens you can spend. If you have dynamic character voices that complement one another, like the mentor and the youth, you have a token there you can spend. You get to spend it once. So spend it, and when you spend it, don't blow through it, right? Like, spend it and spend it well. Like, make the reader sit there and feel it. Use those reflective summaries in that way that like crafts that emotional moment. But and I think so, like, writing's hard.
Yep.
And so
Is
a
it?
lot, I know, right? A lot of this is like, why does it have to be so hard?
Yeah.
Can't it just be easy? Can't we just like, can't I just tell you a story and you like it? And, you know, no. So like, but part of that is like, yeah, it does require a lot of like thinking about this stuff. And again, some of us do it very naturally. Some of them, not me. Some of them do it very naturally. Um, and yeah, it's and I hate those people. I'm just kidding. I love them all.
I
Some
hate
of them
them.
do
I'm gonna say it.
it. Some of them do it very naturally, and you read it and you're like, damn, you crushed that. But for the rest of us, it's something we have to be strategic about in our writing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
fair play. Okay, so as we're talking about voice specifically, how would you, because we hear a lot of talk in the author community about like character voice versus author voice and what is the difference? So how do you define that difference between character voice and author voice?
So author voice, it stretches across works, right? So like, if you've written one book, I don't know that you have a voice yet. You know, Stephen King has a voice. Ray Bradbury has a voice, right? Like, yeah, the author voice stretches across, like Agatha Christie had a voice, right? Like, no, that's not always true, because Harper Lee had a voice and we only got one book from her. So, but author voice has more to do with themes you like to explore, character types you like to have, and plot points that you like to play with.
Mm-hmm.
So like, that's why it stretches across multiple works. So like, I know specifically, I really like the theme in my writing of economic injustice. I like to play with the rich versus the poor. That's you'll find it in every single one of my books. I like to have unsure, anxious characters. That's just something every single book has them. It's something I write. I like unsure, anxious characters. I also like to have lots of moments of deep humor, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I will write a whole scene that has nothing to do with the plot and it's just 3 characters screwing around, right? Like, and it's part of my author voice. Like, I'll send it to a developmental editor and they'll be like, cut this chapter.
Yep.
And I'll be like, you know, hey, look, I'm writing my 12th novel. Like, no, I get it. Like, this is part of what I do.
Yeah.
And I know that, like, I know it shouldn't be in there, but this is part of me. So, like, I'm keeping it. I don't care what you say. So that's not true. But so that's part of, those are the things that make up my author voice, right? Like, I almost always have a scene where I take a character who is, very new and try to completely devastate them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's just something I enjoy in my books. So that's my author voice.
Yeah.
Character voice is about the characters in the story themselves, and so character voice stems from, like, to really understand character voice. Like in the short, character voice is how does your character sound? Because, or how does your character present? So every day when you walk around the world, you encounter people. All of those people have character voices. It has to do with how their voice, how they use words in their voice, the topics they talk about, the body language they use, how often they talk per utterance. So like when they speak to you, do they use a lot of words or a few words? Are there like one sentence, or are there a ton of run-on commas, right? Like, and then when they're in a group of 3 or more, how often do they participate in the conversation? So we kind of like break it down to those 5 things. Like that's a character voice. I think the problem authors have a lot is they confuse character voice with character background. So character background are like the details of like genetics of your character, where your character's position is in culture, what your character's role is in society, does your character have magic or not, right? Like those are all like character background things. And so a lot of times I'll be like, hey, author, what's your character voice? What's this character's voice? And they'll be like, well, they're an orphan and they grew up by themselves and they don't know their parents and they have magic, but they don't know how to use it, right? Like this is, I'm not making fun of anybody. These are just like standard things that people tell me because I'm Shane. So that's like so that's the background. That's not the voice.
Yeah.
And then people will be like, well, I'll be like, well, so that's the background, not the voice. What's the voice? And they'll be like, well, they're really shy, and or they're snarky, or they're very overconfident, or they're a lone wolf who's closed off to the world. That's the personality. That's not the voice. The voice is like, okay, so we've got this personality that has developed out of the character background. Like think of the personality as like, because of the character background, the character behaves this way in the world. That's the personality. And the question is like, how does that personality present to the world? Because of that personality, what are the topics the character talks about? What kind of language does the character use? Is it educated or uneducated? Is it simple? Does the character specifically use simple words? Does the character change their language all the time, right? Like charming characters will actually match what they're saying to the people they're talking to, right? Like, so how is the character using words? What's the character's body language? Because a lot of times we relate body language to emotion, and body language does relate to emotion, but it has to be grounded in character voice.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't matter how excited a shy character is, they're not going to wave their hands around, right? Like, so you got to tie it into the character voice and then to the emotion. And then the number of words used per utterance and the number of utterances per segment, or like the number of times the character talks in a conversation. The reason like I try to push authors to make that distinction between personality and voice is because when we really talk about voice, it gets to like what's on the page. Because going back to monomouth, you can feel like all my characters sound the same, but that doesn't mean you know how to change them. So by defining character voice well for your characters, if you're suffering from monomouth, I'm going to tell you like, okay, take your second most popular character in the book, the character that like shows up the second most. Let's keep your protagonist, your main character, don't touch him, leave him the same. Use your author voice, it's fine. The second character, right? Like, let's take them and let's look at these 5 things and let's change 3 of them. You don't have to change all of them. Just change 3 of them. Tell me what the personality is you were looking for. And then let's say like, well, okay, so right now they're really snarky and mean, but I really want them to be kind and shy. Okay, great. So topics, they have to say nice things about people. It really is this simple. They have to say nice things about people. And if they're shy, when it comes to like the words they use, very few words. And like you get 4 words per utterance. That's all you get. Maybe 2 sentences of 3 words, but that's all you get. And then when it comes to their participation in a conversation, somebody's going to have to call them out. They're not going to talk. They can have inner thoughts all day, but somebody's going to have to, like, their vocalizations have to be pulled out of them. If you go through like 3 scenes and you make you just isolate that character when they speak and you make those changes, you're going to start moving away from monomouth, right? Like, and then we can do that with like, okay, let's look at your third character and like, what personality you want them to have? Let's take our 5 things. Let's change like 2 or 3 of these 5 things. And then let's go through those same 5 scenes and just edit that voice. Like, don't edit the whole piece. Just look at when that person speaks and what they say it in that voice. And then then you can go back and read the whole piece and be like, does the piece still work? But when you start editing, just isolating the voices, something I'll have authors do is actually go through a scene and highlight every utterance the character makes. Like every time the character participates, that's not an inner thought, I'll highlight it. That's body language or a vocalization. I'll highlight it in a color. And I'll be like, you're only allowed to edit yellow. You're only allowed to read yellow. Just read this character's voice and just edit that character's voice.
Yeah.
And then you can come back to the piece after you've done that and be like, okay, how has it changed now that I've diversified my characters? Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so you mentioned cast building a little earlier.
Yeah.
Very briefly. And as part of your book coaching services, you do offer cast building sessions. So
they're some of my favorite. Cast building sessions are super fun.
Yeah, I've done a cast building session with you. It is a lot of fun.
It is fun.
Great. So what would you advise a writer who comes to you and says they don't know where to start with building a cast of characters? Like they have no idea what type of characters they need in their novel or how to go about creating them?
Ooh, that's a good question. I should have read these before I came on.
Yeah,
so I'm just kidding. I totally did. I'm just teasing you. Stall for time. No, so I'm going to go high level and then low level. Like talk about so the reason cast building is important is because your differing character voices actually set up conflict for you in scenes. So you're seeing and set up the emotional journey you want to take, right? Like, let's say you want your book to be an action-packed wild ride. If most of your scenes are too shy characters, it's going to be very, very difficult to write an action-packed wild ride because they're just not expressive enough to pull that off, right? So you've got to settle, part of the reason cast building is important is because your cast creates the conflicts for the journey your reader's going to take, right? So, take as a kid, I used to love the Lethal Weapon movies with Mel Gibson and Danny Glover. Most of the conflict of that story, even though they're cops running around with bad guys, most of the emotional conflict of that story comes from you've got unhinged yet empathetic Mel Gibson and a exhausted and grumpy Danny Glover, and you put them in a car together, and now the scenes write themselves, right? Like, because those two voices are going to play off of each other. And then by the time they got to the second movie, they're like, we got to add a third voice here because both of these voices, while they conflict with each other, they're both pretty stoic in times of action. When you get to times of action, both of those voices lock in. So we need somebody in the back seat being weird just to give the scene more texture. So you throw Joe Pesci in there, who's going to talk a mile a minute. He's going to use 1,000 commas on the page. He's not going to gain any new information to any conversation. He's just going to comment on what's happening in this circular way, right? But that's why cast building is important, because you're looking at your scene, you're like, how do I want this to feel? Well, if I keep Danny Glover and Mel Gibson in the scene, this is a very serious movie, Lethal Weapon 1. If I put Joe Pesci in, now it's a comedy. And I want it to be a comedy, so I need Joe Pesci in the back seat. So that when we do cast building, if a writer's like, I have no idea where to start, I start with okay, we just walk through each character, tell me their backstory. Because of this backstory, how do they operate in the world? What's their personality? And then we'll say okay, because of this personality, this is probably how they should sound. Sometimes writers need to start with well, here's their personality. Forget their backstory. Here's their personality. And we'll be okay, let's talk about how that sounds. But we start with your main character, and then we go to okay, let's talk about the characters that are going to empower your character to become the best that they can be. The Samwise to the Frodo. Frodo's your main character. Who do we pair Frodo with that's a helper, And then what about, and then we do their character voice, and we design their character voice in ways that complement Frodo's voice. And then we do, so like, Frodo is very anxious and very inner, right? Like he's anxious and inner, and he's very methodical at times. Sam shares Frodo's empathy, but is far more expressive. So you put the two of them together, they complement each other in empathy. They complement each other in their like deep desire to do this thing, but then they separate in that Frodo's internal and Sam is expressive, right? So we can start to pull Frodo toward expressive by matching him with Sam. And then we say like, okay, so what character is going to make this challenging for Frodo? Notice I'm not talking heroes and villains or allies or opponents. I'm talking about who helps the character become the best that they are. That could be a good guy or a bad guy, right? Like Batman's greatest engine, the one that helps him become who he is the Joker. Because the Joker's voice forces Batman to make choices and decisions that help Batman decide who he is. Now, the Joker's a villain, but he is what we call Batman's engine, and that he's empowering Batman to be the best he can. In the same way, like, for Frodo, you're going to pull in Smeagol, or I can't remember, Gollum, who is going to walk around with Frodo and Sam. Gollum and Sam's voices are opposite. Gollum is incredibly selfish. Gollum is incredibly internal, just like Frodo is. In fact, has whole conversations with just himself, right? Like, so very internal, like Frodo is, and very methodical, like Frodo is. So you have this like separating, you have these two, you put the goal of a cast building session is be like, okay, these characters are in a lot of scenes together. How do they impact each other? How do they push and pull against each other? And how do we create their voices to accentuate that push and pull that you want in your plot, right? So if that's not working, because a lot of times I'll be like, okay, so how do these characters impact each other? And the writer's like, I don't know. I'll ask like, okay, let's look at your protagonist and let's ask, how do you want your protagonist to grow and change? So like, what's the protagonist's voice at the beginning of the story? What's the protagonist's voice at the end of the story? How does the protagonist grow and change? And then we can be like, all right, well, if the protagonist is going to go from shy to expressive, then we need to put an expressive character around the protagonist to encourage them to be expressive. And we need to put a shy character around the protagonist to encourage them not to change, right? Like, so we got to put those like two, or if we go back to the Batman example, if we want Batman to become less self-obsessed and dark, then we have to put a character around him that's constantly forcing him to engage and explain things, right? So that's when you throw the Joker in. And we also need a character that actually encourages him to be routinely self-obsessed and dark, and that's where you take, usually in Batman comics, it's typically his love interest that's actually like pulling him down. So it's that like, you throw those two things in, and now we can build some character voices using the 5 components based on how we've decided the cast needs to work together. But that's the kind of work we do in a cast building session. It's not something you like, a lot of authors need me for it one time.
Yeah.
Once you do it once and once you see it, you're like, oh, I got it. And when I first started writing, I was super, super poor. I'm still moderately poor, but back then I was super, super poor. So I would hear about these services people offer, and I would be like, I would love to do that. I actually really need that. I cannot afford that. Right? Like, I'm feeding 5 children. Like, I can't. I'm working. Back then I had a different day job, and it was not great. And so, and I had made lots of bad financial decisions leading up to that day job about the other jobs I'd taken. I worked for the mission, Shane. It was about the mission. So, yeah, not about the paycheck. I was getting paid in good vibes. I was getting paid in good vibes. So it's that like, but so I now am conscious about like, hey, you may not be able to afford the cast building session with me. just go through it. I'm going to give you a hint. Just go through my podcast list. I do cast building sessions on there all the time. You can listen to somebody else do it and figure it out for yourself. And that's a very intentional on my part. Is like, look,
Yes.
yeah, it would be better if you spend an hour and a half with me doing this, but if you can't afford an hour and a half with me, don't worry. I do it like 15 times in the last 20 episodes for free. So you can just go find them and listen to other people do it. And that's what I had to do as an author. Like when I was
Yeah.
getting started, I was like, I can't pay for this person's editing services. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go read every book that they've written and listen
Yeah.
to every podcast that they've been on. And I'm going to learn how they're doing this. And then I'm going to write them a thank you note and be like, hey, I couldn't afford your services, but you put all this out in the world for free. And I really, really appreciate it. So that's my recommendation. If you're listening to this, you're like, oh, I want to do that, but I can't do that. You know, there's ways to do it. There's a lot of free stuff that I'm putting out that you can go find all of this. It just takes a little more work.
Yeah, but which is awesome because, like you said, not
Yeah.
everyone can afford this stuff, and it can get horrendously expensive. So
Mm-hmm.
that's a really great thing.
Yeah.
You did mention engines in that little kind of conversation we just had.
I was trying not to. I
I
try not
know.
to use insider language.
No, I know.
It's
So
dialogue or insider language.
for those people who don't know, can you just give a little explanation of vehicles, engines, anchors, and hazards? I mean, we've touched on engines already, but
yeah. So again, all of this comes out of the community, right? Like, so I'm very much a like team player. I need a team around me. And I personally need problems to solve in order to like motivate me to move things forward. So we encountered a problem in the community, which was like we were using this language when we were cast building of hero and villain. Like, oh, this is the good guy, this is the bad guy, or this is the protagonist or antagonist. And a lot of times it'd be like, well, this is an ally to the protagonist, but they're not really a good guy, right? Like the classic example I think of is because it happens all the time in romance is like Bridget Jones' Diary. You've got two men, and I'm going to use the movie version because it's more people have seen it. You got two men, Colin Firth and Hugh Grant. Hugh Grant is kind of an ally through some of the show, especially when it comes to her work. Colin Firth is definitely an antagonist through most of the show. She hates that dude through most of the show. And she even says several times, she's like, he brings out the worst in like he not the worst in me, but he makes me do this behavior that's like whenever I get around him, I'm gonna fight with him. Like we're gonna argue. It's very Pride and Prejudice, right? Like, you know, they're both too proud, they're both too prejudiced. So every time they get around each other, they're like clash, 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 clash. So the question is like, is he an antagonist or a protagonist? Well, he's the love interest, but he's not a protagonist. So these words became unhelpful as we were talking about cast building. So we came up with new words and we were like, all right, the characters that we're following, those are vehicle characters. So in Bridget Jones' Diary, Bridget's the vehicle, right? Like we're going on an emotional journey with Bridget. If you have more than one point of view, you have multiple vehicles, it gets complicated. So we're just going to stick with one where there's a single vehicle. And I'll come back to multiple vehicles in a second. So Bridget Jones is our vehicle. We're going on this emotional journey with her. Every scene, we're experiencing the emotional waves through her, right? Colin Firth, although his character is always fighting with her, he actually brings out the best in her. He is, when we think about who we want Bridget to become, she actually says it at the first of the movie. She's like, I want to be more self-confident. I want to be more assured of myself. I want to like stop all these terrible habits. I want to get control of my life. When Colin Firth comes around and they fight, her character voice modulates into the character we want her to be. She's self-confident. She's not afraid to share her opinions. She doesn't like fall all over herself in weird ways, and her bad habits go away because she's so like focused on being in this conversation with this guy, right? Like, so we started calling those characters engines because they take your vehicle and they propel them toward who they're supposed to be. And then characters like Hugh Grant, when she gets around Hugh Grant, she's a mess. She's an emotional mess. She does all of the things. He encourages her to do all of the choices that she doesn't want to make anymore. He encourages body shaming, right? Like he shames her body all the time and like makes her self-conscious. So he's like pushing her down into the worst version of herself. So we call those characters anchors because they take your vehicle and they literally like pull them down to the worst version of themselves. That helps when we're talking about cast building, is like the role of the characters. And then we get to this, we have these one-off characters that a lot of times we call side characters, but they're not always side characters, right? Sometimes they actually show up routinely, but their job is just to make the character swerve. Your vehicle character, their job is to like force your vehicle character to do something. So in Bridget Jones' Diary, she's got this group of friends. They're all very loud. They're all very big personalities. You get around them and you have to swerve around them. You cannot just like keep being yourself in their presence, right? Like, and that's their role in the story. Their role is to show up at reflective moments for Bridget and make Bridget reflect, force Bridget to think about. So hazard characters, we talk about like getting their voices really big and really distinct so that they force, and if the character is like self-conscious, then you want characters that are going to empathize and poke at that character at the same time, to push that self-conscious button, to make that character make a decision about, can I be self-conscious here? Can I not be self-conscious here? And when the character is self-conscious, you want those hazard characters to be like, stop it, no, boo. And when the character is too confident, you want those characters to be like, really, seriously, that's who you're going to be? So that's what the point of a hazard character is to like make that vehicle character swerve emotionally so that you can have these moments of reflection. You can have these moments of like testing who the character's becoming. Ideally, you're going to run into the same hazard characters throughout the plot, and so that we can see the character mature and how they handle them. Does that make sense? Like they'll handle them one way at the beginning of the story, and then later in the story, they'll handle them a completely different way so that we can, it's a cheap trick to show character maturity, right? Like it's kind of like what Groundhog Day did in like giant like a whole movie of like, let's just show you the same day over and over again. So yeah, but that's engine anchors, hazards, and again, they're just words, they're tools we use to to help us describe things.
Well, I just wanted to clarify that in case anyone was like, wait, what, engine, who?
Yeah, engine what? What's he talking about? Engine? Did he say my character's a car? Your character's a car.
Yeah, basically. Seeing as you are the self-proclaimed dialogue doctor, I want to. That wasn't as
had to throw in self-proclaimed. Seeing as you walk around telling everybody you're a doctor all the time, even though you do not have a PhD in anything.
Yeah, not that kind of doctor. Anyway, let's talk about dialogue tags, because we've all heard the kind of sage advice. I'm moving on from that. I'm not.
Nice transition. Way to go. I love
really
it.
Smooth. Really
smooth.
So we've all heard that we should never use any tag other than said and asked, or rather that's a really popular opinion in the writing space, or that we shouldn't use them at all.
Which is that gets really confusing. You get like a 5-person scene and you're like, no dialogue tag.
Who is it? Who's talking?
I feel so bad for others because I see them like so strong, like everybody's moving all the time. Stephanie twitched. I don't like this idea. Biddy smiled. It's a good idea, I say, right? Like it's just like, oh man, you are so like, this rule is killing you.
Yeah, right, exactly. So what is, I mean, we've just heard your stance on not using them at all, but what's your stance on kind of just sticking to said and asked and never veering into anything else?
So that advice was created, I think, this is my assumption of why both of those were created. They're created in like English lit classes when like the professor's really struggling to get nuanced because we're literally just like learning how to write a sentence. And so he gets this thing back that's like, you know, she enunciated, she proclaimed, she declared authoritatively. And you're like, all right, just you said, like change the words inside the vocalization, stop like trying to fix your vocalization with this thing. That's how you get the like just use this. The other side of like stop using them is, I think that advice comes often when you're having a one-on-one conversation, like two people talking, and you don't need dialogue tags when two people are talking, because you have paragraph spacing to give you that, like, to explain who's talking. So like, take them all out, and then we as authors are like, they said take them all out, we can never have them, and then we're like, they said only use said, we can only use said all the time ever. So I think that's I am guilty of that kind of like weird rule following, where like I take a rule and like run 10 times too far with it. So what I encourage writers to do is, again, think of it not as a rule, but as a tool. A dialogue tag is a tool. And ask yourself, like, what does this tool do? What's it for? Right? Like, hammers are great for banging on things. Hammers are really bad for screwing in a screw.
Yes.
Right? Like, so you got to know what your tool is for, so you know how to use it. And dialogue tags do three different things. They identify who's speaking. In a one-on-one conversation, you don't need to identify who's speaking after the first couple exchanges, right? In a 3 to 5 person conversation, 3 to 7 person conversation that we call a big cast conversation, who's speaking is super important. So you need that tag. Like, you have to use that tool. So they identify who's speaking. They allow us to construct an utterance. So this is hard to describe without words on the page, but you've got your character's vocalization. So let's say that I was like, tomorrow I think I might go to the store and then to the museum. And Jeff said, right? I'm just going to tag that thing on at the end, like Jeff said, to specify like this is who's talking. But all my vocalization comes together. So when you read it on the page, you hear, I think tomorrow I'm going to go to the store and then the museum. If you want to make me sound more thoughtful, you're going to be like, Jeff rubbed his chin and said, I think tomorrow, period, I might go to the store, period. Jeff rubbed the back of his head, and then to the museum, period. Right? Like, so I'm using dialogue tags and body language in that utterance, which please don't put that on paper because it's terrible. Terrible writing. I like Jeff's advice, but the examples he gave were just total crap. So, terrible example. But I'm using that dialogue tag and that body language to slow down how you're hearing the utterance to shape a character voice, right? So if you've got an action-focused character that's always like immediate, get those dialogue tags at the back. If you have a character that is thoughtful, get those dialogue tags up front so it makes it sound like they're pausing before they talk. If you have a character that's like measured, a lot of times, I always think about the character voice of President Barack Obama. You're going to put those dialogue tags and periods in the middle of what they're saying. So a lot of times, or like, to go back to our other example, I think Jeff said, as he looked at the sky, I'll go to the store tomorrow, period. Jeff looked down at his shoes and thought about what he was going to say next. And then the museum, period. Right? Like, so that's a character that's like more, you can hear the difference between the thoughtful character and the methodical character. And then all I'm doing is using those dialogue tags to like create how that vocalization sounds. So that's the second thing dialogue tags do for us, is they like help the reader interpret the utterance in the. And the third thing they do for us is they add expressiveness to. That's when you're going to start using words like demanded and yelled and screamed, and like, those are great. Like, if you want to see somebody use them in a masterful way, go read anything by Toni Morrison, where like she uses dialogue tags in this, like, that's actually how I learned to use them, was reading Toni Morrison. So, but she uses those like expressive dialogue tags all the time in order to like help the reader hear how this character sounds. So they bring they You use dialogue text to identify the reader. Really important in 3 to 5 person conversations, 3 or more person conversations. Not important in 2-person conversations, right? Shaping a character voice, though, very important in 2-person conversations. So you may still be using dialogue tags as a tool to shape a character voice in 2-person conversations. And and then continuing that in larger conversations. And then the idea of like creating a deeper expression of the vocalization with dialogue tags is that third one. Again, you might use that in a 2-person or a 3 to 5 person. That one is one of those, like we were talking about reflective summaries, where it is a hammer. If you just keep beating on the reader with like these dialogue tags, they stop seeing them. So you do have to use that sparingly. Like they can't yell every expression, right? Like if they yell every utterance, then they're not actually yelling anymore. They just talk really loud, right? Like, so you have to like decide, like that's one of those that like pull out of your pocket sparingly. But again, there are no rules. And this is where, like we were talking about author voice earlier, this is part of your author voice, how you're using these tools, right? Like the way that you take these, we all have the same tools, right? Like we're all playing with the same tools. We all have reflective summaries. We all have dialogue. We all have dialogue tags. We all have ways to shape the emotional journey, right? Like, we all have characterization and character voice and like these things that we can do. We all have plot lines, right? Like we all have, how you start to shape those, how you use those tools is your author voice, right? Like, so, there's no right or wrong way to use a tool. There's just reader expectations and reader burden. So the reader's showing up with an expectation. And if you want to be Jose Saramago and you want to write with no punctuation, great, fantastic. You've put a huge burden on the reader to like get on your page of your author voice and how you're using the tools. But you know what? If you're Jose Saramago, you do it so good it doesn't matter. Readers are like, yeah, I'm showing up for this, right? Like, so there aren't any rules. There's just expectations and burden. And as you're doing it, so, but like if you're writing genre fiction and you're writing like, what I write, which is like penny paperback mysteries, like, you'd buy these at the gas station when you were a kid. Don't put a lot of burden on the reader. What are you doing? Why would you do that? Do what everybody else does, right? Like, it's that kind of like, you got to decide like what your author voice is and what you're writing. If you're writing, really intense literary fiction, then yeah, you need a distinct author voice. You got to use these tools in creative ways. But, if you're just writing, like I do, like the next Mo and Stacy mystery novel, then don't use them differently. Do what everybody else is doing, because your reader's coming to have an experience they've already had, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely makes sense. My next question is a little bit facetious, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
Okay.
So italics, right? I want to talk about italics.
Never.
Apart from never.
That's my only rule. Everything else is a tool except that. That is a rule.
What?
I'm just kidding. I actually love
it. Yeah, I know you do. But why such strong opinions on italics, Jeff?
I think so. I got a bad rap. I could name the author who gave it to me, but I will not. Do you know who you are? So just kidding. So I'm very firm on italics because authors use them as a crutch.
Yeah.
It is a tool that we use all the time. And it is the hammer that we like come to screws and try to get them in with. Like, it is the thing that we just can't seem to stop hitting Control I. We love Control I. So my advice to authors on italics are like, you get to use them once. You get to use them for one thing. You can decide in your book what you use them for. They can be for foreign words. They can be for names of places. They can be for inner thoughts. They can be for a specific character voice, right? Like, the author of Murderbot, whose name I can't remember off the top of my head, she uses italics for a specific type of communication, through like when they're communicating through this type of comm in their spaceship. That's when the italics are added, right? Like, so you can use italics to identify whatever you want. They're just a tool. You have to pick one. You cannot use them for all of those things. And so often authors are like, I'm using italics for foreign words and for names of places and for inner thoughts. And so then in the middle of a paragraph, all of a sudden I have like 3 italics and I'm like, wait, is that in the character's head, or is that a name of a place, or is that a foreign word? And here's the hard part. When we talked about like putting burden on the reader, readers 9 times out of 10 will assume you're an idiot. They just do. They will assume until you become Stephen King.
Yeah.
Until you have such a reputation that you are unquestionable, they will assume this idiot doesn't know what they're doing. So just...
They will tell you as well.
They will. They will tell you. They will tell you. So just know that, like, as you're creating burden for them, you have to be strategic about it. And italics is, I promise, italics is not the tool you want to be creative with. It's not as fun as you think it is. Of course, I say that, and then, like, you know, there are books that are written entirely in italics, which I do not understand at all. No, but I know it is a choice that that author made when he wrote, that Cormac McCarthy made when he wrote The Road. I get it. Like, it was a choice, and it's brilliant, right? Like, but are you Cormac McCarthy? Like, you know, are you Jose Saramago? Can you have no punctuation? If you can, do that. But if you can't, maybe don't do that. If you're like telling, like, you know, the next adventures of Mo and Stacy, maybe don't play with italics that much, right? Like, so that's the thing, is like, I don't hate italics, but it is a common thing I see with authors all the time, where they're like, oh, this is inner thought and the voice of the alien, and I also use it when I identify certain space words. I'm like, no, you get to pick one. It cannot be inner thoughts and the voice of the alien. It cannot be both, because I don't know when your protagonist is having an inner thought and when the alien's talking. I can't, like, you can't do that. So, I mean, you can. Is it wise? Like, you can do whatever you want, but is it?
And that's the takeaway from the show. No, it's not.
That's do whatever the hell you want. I don't care.
Do what you want.
Yeah, do what you want. All your characters can be blue. It's fine. We'll just call your book The Blue Book. The Blue and Confusing, where all your characters are blue and 3 out of 4 speak in italics. Great. Let's do that. We'll see how that goes. But I say that jokingly, but it is art, right? Like, this is where, like, we move from, like, the science to art. Like, how you use these tools is your artistic expression. Recognizing, I think the step we don't take, though, is that we don't recognize that we are using tools and that we are using them. We are making choices about how we use them. So when it comes to italics, just strategically choose not to use them. That's the easiest way to go.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
No, but I get it, because, like, you see, I mean, even if you were to use a flashback for one thing, but it's quite and italics for one thing, and it's quite heavy, like in a flashback. So I've seen a lot of books where flashbacks are all in italics. Reading page upon page of italic is quite hard on the eye, right?
Can be, but, like, you know, my problem isn't like, oh, I'm going to read 3 pages of italics because of a flashback. My problem is that, like, I'm going to read 3 pages of italics because of a flashback, and then the next chapter, you're putting inner thoughts from first-person POV character in italics, and I'm like, wait, is this a flashback?
Yeah.
Or is this an inner thought? Like, what are we doing here? And then, like, 2 chapters later, there's a guy speaking in French, and he's in italics. And I'm like, wait, is everything he says a flashback? Or is everything he says an inner thought? I'm so confused. Or is it just French now that's in italics? And then you'll get to a chapter where you as an author get yourself in trouble because you're like, I want a flashback in French. It's like, okay, okay. Are we flashback? Or is it French? Is it like, are the French languages the flashback and then everything else is like an inner thought? Like, what are we doing here? And that's where it starts to get confusing, because we just like, you know, It's like, oh, I need this to stand out, so I'm gonna hit Control I. It's really easy. I'm just gonna highlight this paragraph, Control I this thing, and then you're like, oh no, like now I'm in big trouble because I don't even remember that in chapter 2 I had inner thoughts. That's the other thing too, is that like we'll use these tools for one chapter because we really need them, and then we forget about them by chapter 14.
Yeah.
Like I've worked with so many authors who are like, chapter 2 and 3 the character has a deep inner thought life, and then by chapter 5 like the inner thoughts are like once every 5 paragraphs, and then by chapter 14 there's no inner thoughts at all because the writer's actually gotten into the groove and doesn't need that tool anymore. And I'll be like, what you're telling me in your character growth is that your character is going brain dead because they had this really rich inner thought life, and by chapter 14 you don't have it anymore. So what you're telling me is the growth of your character is the growth to like turning off their inner child. So like, but it is that like we got to be strategic about how we're doing things.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. If you had to choose one fictional character and say that they have your favorite character voice of all time, which character would it be and why?
Man Called Ove.
I thought I was going to. Oh, I've got that
Bachman.
to read next. I have that to read right now.
Yeah, he's my inner. He's my Patronus. He's my inner. He's the old angry man that doesn't want to talk to people is my inner child. That's my that's who I am. Yeah, so that's easy.
Okay. Why would you say that character voice is your favorite?
Because he's me.
Oh, right. That is why.
That is why. He's me. Yeah. I also love that. I think Bachman is writing some of the best character work right now. Like his book, Anxious People.
Mm-hmm.
The voices are so great and they're so different and they're so strong. Beartown, the voices are really distinct and very good. Like, I don't know that he's like the greatest writer of our time. I wouldn't say that, but he is a powerful character writer. And so if you're looking for really strong character voices and like how they look different on the page, how they use dialogue tags to move them around, Toni Morrison and Bachman are 2 great places to start looking at that. But I did connect to Ove on like a deep emotional level. Like I was like, yeah, this is my dude. And I think part of that is like, I don't know. I've had a lot of weird trauma, social trauma in life. And I think it just ages you on the inside. So I tend to connect to grumpy, angry characters. It is part of my author voice too. I have an Ove-like character in every book. In the last book I published, Inside Outside, there's a character named Popeye, who is my inner Ove. The new book, Nerds, season 1, there's a character named Buck, who is my inner Ove, right? Like he is just my like grumpy, angry character. So a lot of times people will read books and they'll be like, oh, like people read Inside Out side and they'll be like, oh, you're so the lead character, I can see you in the lead character. I'm like, no, if you really knew, I'm actually Popeye. I'm an angry bitter old guy who's like commenting on how much life stinks. Like, 30 years ago I was the main character, but now I'm Popeye. Like, so like it's like, but it's that, yeah, I think that, just going back to author voice. What's yours? Can I ask what yours is?
Well, I didn't think about this question ahead of time.
That's not fair. You can't answer. You ask me questions you're not ready to answer.
Yeah, I don't know. Like my favorite character voice ever. I really love character voices that modulate well, or characters who their voice is distinctly different depending on the situation they're in. And that could be because they're playing a part, as in their character is also playing a part in the show or a book, or they have like I love characters that have a hidden identity or a secret past. So one of my absolute favorites is actually the TV version and the book, Stay Close by Harlan Coben. The main character, Cassie, is actually not Cassie at all. She is Megan.
Yeah.
And she comes from a completely different background to where she is now. So a lot of her, I wouldn't say a lot of her current personality is fabricated, but it's a personality that she has had to adopt over time to fit in this very like suburban, rural, kind of soccer mum type persona, when actually she comes from kind of inner city, she used to be a prostitute. So obviously very, very different
Nice.
life and
Yeah,
background. So
yeah.
they're the types of character voices that I really love, where they have a real distinction, and then they go back, someone from their old life shows up, and it kind of, they don't know quite how to behave. I think that's
Yeah,
fascinating.
that's very fascinating. Can I do a character voice I really admire that I
Yeah,
wish I
go.
could write?
Hmm.
Sarah Gerbel, who is a screenwriter who wrote the first several seasons of Supernatural.
Yes.
She did the adaptation of Magicians, which I love, the book Magicians, the 3 books of
Yeah, I
Magicians,
like the books.
and then I watched the show, and I was like, this is the first time ever where I think the characters are better in the show than in the
It's a good
books.
show.
Yeah, and then she did she does You for Netflix.
All right, and that's what I've got to watch next.
Yeah,
People keep telling me to watch it. Like, watch it.
she does this specific character voice, like it's part of her author voice. In Magicians, it's Quentin Coldwater in the show. Quentin in
Yeah,
the books is very different than Quentin
yeah.
in the show, and in You, it's the character Joe, and it is a arrogant yet unself-aware, and I love it so much because it's a weird character voice of like confidence in your own opinion, but then being so wrong about the world around you at the same time. So like You is the best example of it. Joe, that character, he's got this running inner monologue. He's constantly talking about how he sees the world and and what he thinks people are. And if you pay attention, he's almost always wrong. But he's so confident that he's right. But he's almost always wrong. It's the best. And Quentin was the same way in The Magicians. He's like
Yes.
super confident in who he is, but he is so wrong all the time.
99.9% of the time. Yeah.
I love
Yeah.
those. I so want to be able to write that voice, and I can't write that voice. I really wish I could. I've tried and it doesn't come out the same way. My characters just come out being a-holes. But like she has a way of doing it that also make them so empathetic. And it's just like, oh man, this is powerful. This is a powerful, yeah.
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 Great
I really
examples.
yeah.
Great examples.
That's one I've been looking at recently that I'm like really jealous of. I'm like, oh, I wish I could pull that character voice off. I can't figure that one out.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a good one.
Yeah, I like that. Okay, time for my favorite and last question of the show, and it's one that I will be asking every single one of my guests.
Nice.
So, Jeff Elkins, why do you write fiction?
So there's a dual reason to that. One is for money. I have children in college. I have to pay for tuition. Like that's actually why I started writing.
Yeah.
I was fired from a job very suddenly and was left with, and the firing stained because I worked in the nonprofit sector. Once you're fired, it's like a scarlet letter on your forehead. Every nonprofit's like, well, why? And you can't say because the people who fired me were a bunch of idiots. You can't say that because then you were like, oh, this guy's a monster. So like, you're just like stuck. It's not like the corporate world where you're like, well, A, B, and C happened and that resulted in D, which they see all the time. So like, yeah, it's no big. In nonprofits, it's so relational. So like I was kind of like scarlet lettered. And it was like, oh, this is going to be really hard. And I was like, my wife was like, when I was let go, technically I resigned, but they didn't actually give me a choice. When I was let go, my wife we were 3 months to the due date of my 5th child.
Oh, wow.
I had just moved and bought a new house for the job that had the new salary. And we had like upended our lives completely. And so like, and all of a sudden I'm in this new place with this new house and this 5th baby on the way, and I have no income. And I was like, I can never be dependent on one stream of income again. So for me, writing fiction was very much like, what skills do I have? I've written a ton of short stories. I can do this one thing. I know that I can do this. So that was a major part of it. I will say, as I did it, a new thing formed, which is fiction is very emotionally healing for me. I do have a lot of like traumatic moments in life, and so fiction allows me to toy with those feelings. I don't rewrite the things I've experienced, I rewrite the emotions I felt. So fiction allows me to take these moments that are like just, things that live in my brain that are like, I would like to get rid of this thing, or I would like to spend some time processing this thing that
Yeah.
happened,
Yeah.
or this thing that I participated in that I wish I hadn't, or just I have this emotional moment living in my brain that I would like to take out and examine for a little bit. And fiction gives me the ability to do that. It gives me the ability to take those emotional moments and just play with them and be like, okay, how does this feel? What did I sound like when this happened? What did other people sound like? How did we modulate? How did this change us as characters over time? And so
Yes.
for me, when I write fiction, I find the emotional moments I want to experience, and then I overlay a plot on top of those, and I write to that plot. But it does, so for me, it is about emotional processing as well.
Awesome. Well, that's a very poignant way to end. So, if you could tell everyone where they can find out a bit more about you and everything that you do.
You can find my dialogue work at dialoguedoctor.com. That's the easiest place to go. There's a button there that says learning. You can sign up for the weekly newsletter we put out that's totally free, and the podcast. While we're recording this, I just released episode 131. So
Yeah, you did.
all of the podcast episodes are there. Shane is on 7 podcasts, I think.
He's not joking. That
I
wasn't
think
a
you've been on
joke.
7. No, I'm being serious. I've edited you, like you and I have done editing sessions on 3, and I think you've been on 4 as like part of a group or an interview. So I
Possibly.
think you've been on 7.
Yeah.
So yeah, so you're over there a lot. And then and
Notice
there's
how he
other
said that
things.
with like a disparaging, like, oh, you're
No,
over
I
there
meant
a
that in a
lot.
great way. I would have you on every week if I could get away with it. Um, if I didn't think you'd show me up by being smarter than I am, have you on every. That's why I've only had you on 7, because you show me you're smart, and I'm like, all right, well, he can't come back for another month because people are going to be like, let's just listen to Shane's podcast. So
Well, I mean, you can do that.
damn it,
You can
it's
just
all
listen to
backfiring.
mine.
It's all backfiring. So no, I'm just kidding. I'm super excited about your podcast. So dialoguedoctor.com. If you're interested in my fiction, it's jeffelkinswriter.com. And by the time this comes out, I'll actually have started another podcast on
What?
theology. Yeah, I'm
What?
starting a podcast on. This is a weird story that I'll share right here. I did an interview on a podcast about being an ex-pastor, evangelical pastor. And it was a weird one-off. It was like, I wrote a fiction book about this, so I should talk about it. So, because Inside Outside is about people leaving the evangelical church and like
Mm.
why. And so I was like, I should do an interview about this. So I did, and I had a publisher reach out to me that was like, hey, we want you to write theology nonfiction.
Oh,
And I
wow.
was like, maybe. I was like, I don't know. And he was like, you should think about it. And I do have a book proposal out to him. We're working on a contract right now, but
Cool.
yeah, that'll probably be like 2024 that would come out. But
Yeah.
he was like, hey, to help you process some of this, you're good on podcasts. You should start a podcast. So I went and grabbed a friend down the street who's also an ex church person, ex pastor. Her name's Lee. And I was like, let's just do this. So we got 10 episodes in the can. They're going to start coming out in
Nice.
March of 2023. So
Awesome.
that'll be fun. It's called I Just Came for the Tacos. That's the name of the
Nice.
podcast. Because we just came for the
Nice.
tacos and we walked away with arms full of trauma. So yeah. So I have that coming out too. But you
That's
can find
cool.
my fiction at jeffelkinswriter.com.
Nice. And are we allowed to mention the non-fiction book, the dialogue related
Yeah.
non-fiction book?
Dialogue. By
Okay,
the
cool.
time this episode comes out, hopefully it'll be in the world. So
When are you planning to release?
I'm planning to put pre-orders up mid-March and then release in May. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah,
So
this episode will probably gone up by the time. That's out, so you can go pick that up too.
Yeah,
I have read the book. It's fantastic. So yeah, go get it.
Yeah, so one of my beta readers is making me add examples from actual literature instead of my just like, Jeff is going to the shop and to the museum. That's you.
I don't know who
you did that
is.
to me. No, it really actually is a great note. I was like, I should. My crappy examples that came off the top of my head are fine, but people read them and they're like, man, Jeff has good advice, but he does not know how to write. And it's like, yeah, I should pull some Toni Morrison in here to show you, like, no, really, people do this. It's not just me. I actually have my stack of books right here that I'm like using. I was writing it yesterday, so I have like I'm holding up Ernest Hemingway.
Yeah.
Here's Alex Haley Roots. Here's TJ Klune, The House on the Cerulean Sea. I have my stack of books over here. Here's Pride and Prejudice. I was like, because I was working on this last night, and I was like, what examples do I want in each chapter? So I got my stack over here because of you.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's going to be all the better for it. So because I've made those suggestions, it's going to be a really fantastic book.
It will be. Yeah, it was total crap. It was total crap before your suggestions. But yeah, now it's so much so that I thought about having you a co-author on it, but then I took that back and I'm not going to do that. So you're on your own. Whatever. You've written like 10 books in a year. You're fine. You'll just write another one.
Oh, awesome. Well, this was a lot of fun. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was awesome.
I hope you enjoyed the interview with Jeff and picked up a ton of new dialogue writing tips. Join me next week when I will be super excited because I am joined by the fantastic living legend that is Angela Ackerman, the author of The Emotion Thesaurus and one of the creators behind One Stop for Writers, a fantastic all-in-one system to help authors write their books. Have a great writing week. Thanks for listening to the Write Better Fiction podcast. Remember to hit subscribe on your favorite podcatcher and leave a review, and we'll chat again next time.